The next thing we need to look at culturally then is the subject of education. The next thing we're going to look at culturally is education. Now I'm going to be very brief here because, as I've said before, we have some studies worked up on this in another class. Here, according to our outline, we have two different categories: Roman training and Jewish training under education. We'll start with the Roman training. For the most part, it was private. It was for the rich, and this really didn't change until later in the Roman era. However, they did have public schools as well. You see, the famous and the important people were privately tutored by someone well known. A great philosopher or something were privately tutored, such as Alexander the Great. He was brought up with a private tutor. So the rich and the famous had private tutors. The other people, it didn't really change until later in the Roman era. The average Roman family would send its children to the public school system. The average Roman family would have a slave, which sometimes had two functions. One would be to teach the child the basics. Now, remember whenever we talked earlier about slavery, many times the slaves were the most educated in society. The slaves knew a lot about a lot of different things. And they could really do well, a good job in teaching the child of your average Roman family the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. They had a second function where they would also take him to and from any local public schools or a private school if his parents could afford that. Now we don't have, we've got public school system today, and of course we've got private tutors today. I'm just thinking of the average person. So we're back to what we're talking about here for Rome. The average person doesn't have a private tutor. But people that have things like nannies or people that have live-in help, maybe a live-in type of tutor. And you have to be rich to be able to afford that because you got to pay a person, all the living expenses. They got to eat off your table and live under your roof and plus pay them a salary. Oh, there are many rich people that do that, have a live-in tutor that brings up their children. And that's why sometimes they end up so intelligent, because they have a private tutor that instructs them all the time. In the public school system, you're doing good if you've got a ratio of 1 to 25, one teacher per 25 students. What about the ratio 1 to 1? One tutor per one child. That's a tremendously good ratio. Private schools, they're supposed to be private and cost more because they have a better ratio than the 1 to 25 of the public school system, like maybe a 1 to 18 or something. One teacher for 18 students. And that means, therefore, that you get more personal attention from the teacher if she has or he has fewer students among whom he has to or she has to spread themselves out. You get more personal attention then. If you've got one teacher and 10 students, they're probably going to end up brighter than one teacher and 50 students, where if you're one of those 50, you get the material, you just get it. If you don't, you just don't. The teacher cannot come around and play little teacher role with every single individual pupil in there. Should never get anything done. There are too many pupils there. So on a private basis, this 1-to-1 would really be great, especially if you were rich and you had a private tutor. Let's look at a couple of references in the Bible. In Acts 19 and verse 9, we have a private school, no doubt. And probably it was a school of philosophy. Acts 19 and verse 9. And we're going to look at another one that's very, very important theologically. You may know where that is already. We won't even get into the theology of it, but it is very, very important. But Acts 19. When divers were hardened and believed not, but spake evil of that way before the multitude, then he, Paul, departed from them and separated the disciples, disputing daily in the school of one Tyrannus. And we're at the city of Ephesus here. Paul has, verse 1, passed through the upper coast, came to Ephesus. He's at Ephesus. So we have one school of Tyrannus. What type of school was it? Well, probably a school of philosophy. It was a lecture hall for philosophical students, and Tyrannus was probably the lecturer in charge. And here's what we know about the lecture schools of philosophy in ancient Greece culture. They would start 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, the cool morning hours, and run their lectures for 3 or 4 hours up until around noon. Then around noon it just became too hot to continue sitting there and hearing the lectures, and the school would close down for the day. And so probably, we don't have proof this is what's happening here in Acts 19, but it's a probable notion anyway. Probably the Apostle Paul then would take over the classroom. Maybe he would rent it, or maybe Tyrannus would just allow him to use it, since no one else was going to be using it. Paul would take over the classroom around noon, and then teach Christian doctrine, not philosophy, teach Christian doctrine to Christians. Now what's interesting there is that the Christians would meet at the hottest time of the day then, because that's when they could get a free, or maybe for a small fee, lecture hall open to them. And of course commentators, both ancient and modern, can get really rosy in their thoughts of what happened here in Acts 19. And what I mean by that is maybe looking deeply into this and saying, what a contrast that after Tyrannus finished with his speculative, dead-end philosophical lectures, then the school would empty of all of the perverts and unregenerate, and the blessed Apostle Paul would enter in and teach the imperishable truths of righteousness to the Christians. And of course they saw, what a contrast, that the Christians actually were using a philosophical lecture hall for their studies, and it's just like almost a noted specific contrast between darkness and light. They would empty with all of their speculative notions, and the Apostle Paul would come in with all of his absolutes and all of his definites of Christianity. Maybe get some of those students converted who hung around to hear a few more lectures. Well, the other place I have reference to is, of course, Galatians chapter 3, beginning with verse 20. Well, we need to go earlier than 24, really all the way back up to 21. Here are two references to schools. There it says the school of Tyrannus. Here in the KJV it says the schoolmaster. So that still brings us back to the subject of schools here. Now the Acts 19:9 was a Greek form of school. The Galatians 3 has a Roman connotation behind it. Notice neither one is Jewish yet. We'll get to Jewish here in a moment. Neither one is Jewish. The first was Greek, that's Acts 19:9. The second is Roman, that's Galatians 3. Now let's start with verse 21 then. Is the law then against the promises of God? You know, Paul's been arguing that we are free in Jesus Christ, and we are justified by faith, just like Abraham was, and not by the law. And so then he anticipates someone's opposition. Well then, why do we even have the law? Is the law against all of God's promises? He says no. For if there had been a law given which could have given life, verily righteousness should have been by the law. You know, we want to know what's the purpose of the law then. If it can't save a man, that's what Paul is arguing against in the book of Galatians here, is the law cannot save. The law cannot save. So he anticipates a problem here in someone's question. Well, then why do we have the law? The Scripture hath concluded all under sin, that the promise by faith of Jesus Christ might be given to them that believe. So now he's going to get back to the law issue. But before faith came, we were kept under the law, shut up unto the faith which should afterwards be revealed. Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster, to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after that faith has come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. For ye are all the sons of God by faith in Christ Jesus. For as many of you as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew or Greek, bond or free, male or female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. And if ye be Christ, then are ye Abraham's seed, and your heirs according to promise. Then he goes right on into still talking about Roman customs here. Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from the servant, though he be Lord of all, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. Even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. And because ye are sons, God hath sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Wherefore thou art no more a servant or a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. So really all of that has to be read together, because that's one whole section that Paul is dealing with. Now let's jump back to verses 24 and 25. Because how you interpret what this word that Paul uses here, translated schoolmaster, since we're not trying to be real technical, I've got the Greek here, but I don't suppose I'll give you the Greek. Depending on how we interpret that, our theology is going to be headed in one direction or the other. I mean, what do we think of? We think of schoolmaster. I think of an old, cross-eyed, 17th century man with a rod or a whip in his hand and keeping all those boys in line in that one-room schoolhouse, you know. There's a schoolmaster. Well, that's kind of what we think of as English people, a schoolmaster. In other words, the schoolmaster is the teacher. The schoolmaster is the teacher or the principal or something like that. What does the NIV have here? In 24.
So the law was put in charge to lead us to Christ, that we might be satisfied by faith. Now that faith has come, we are no longer under the supervision of the law.
Supervision. And what does it say in 24? Wherefore the law was our supervision, or we were
Put in charge.
put in charge. Okay. I see what they're doing then. What they're doing is they're not giving you what the word is, but they're giving you the responsibility of the one behind the word. What the word means was it wasn't really a tutor. It wasn't a school teacher. It wasn't a schoolmaster. It was like a slave who had the responsibility of holding the child's hand and walking with them from home to where school was. And then whenever school was over, to go back and wait for them at school, take them by the hand, and walk back home with them again. You see, that's an entirely different thing than schoolmaster. You understand what I'm saying here? This is very important, because you would think of the law as our teacher then, our schoolmaster, the law as our teacher. And Paul, he's not even meaning that at all. There's a very poor translation here in the KJV as a schoolmaster. He says, in other words, what he's saying is the law was our slave, was our father's slave that held our hand and walked with us to school to make sure no beast got us and no people robbed us or beat us up or kidnapped us. That's about all it could really do, is just kind of protect us until we got to school, and then kind of protect us until we got back home again. The law was the slave that took our hand and led us to and from school. Okay? So that's an entirely different meaning. So what the NIV has is in charge, and I think then it uses the word supervision then in verse 25. Well, that's not the best translation, because it was a person involved here. Not just supervision, it was a person. It should have translated a supervisor or the one in charge, because if you read that, you'd have no idea he's talking about a person there. It just says the law was given to charge us or keep us supervised or something like that, and you fail to get the image or the correct picture in your mind of a human being. The human being is the notion, the idea meant behind this word, Greek term that's translated schoolmaster in verse 24 and schoolmaster in verse 25. So that's very significant. It gives you a different meaning than you would get from the KJV as to the purpose of the law then. In one case you'd see the law as our teacher. The other case you would see it as not our teacher, but the slave of the Father that just protected us enough, kept us out of trouble so we didn't fall into the river. You know, what would you be doing on the way to and from school? You'd probably go fishing first thing on the way to school. and maybe miss the first couple of classes there. In other words, you'd get off the road, you'd get off the path. The law wants to make sure you don't make any detours and go fishing over here and skip the first class. On the way home, go shoot little hoops so you don't make it home on time or something. It's there whenever school is out, there's the slave. He's waiting there at the door to take your hand. If it was a large school, you'd have many slaves outside. Like you'd tether your horse in the old days by the saloon out west or something, you'd tether your slaves all along there, and they'd be waiting, looking for little Bobby or little Johnny or little Alexander the Fourth, waiting for him there to take him by the hand and lead him back home whenever it was time to go home. So that's a pretty interesting reference there to schools then. So there that covers Greek schools and the Roman school as they're appearing here in the New Testament. And then we've got Jewish training then next. Now, Jewish education differed quite a bit from other forms of training, because basically they used only the Old Testament as their textbook. No classes in philosophy, mathematics, sculpture, drama, poetry, dance, the fine arts, literature. No classes in any of those. They had one class, and it was called the Bible. You say, well, how'd they ever learn to read or write out of the Bible? That's the best writing book you could have right there. It'll teach you how to make your C's just like another writing book will. And while making your C, it'll teach you that that's the first letter in the name Christ also. And then whenever you learn H and R and I and S and T, pretty soon you're not only learning how to spell, but you're learning these important names here. Of course, we're talking about New Testament there. But for the Old Testament, you'd get Yahweh or something then. How would you learn to read? You'd practice reading right out of the Scriptures. And rather than being familiar with Rip Van Winkle or Mother Goose, you'd be familiar with Prophet Moses from your early days there. Instead of Aesop's fables or something, you'd be familiar with. You see, we're familiar, a lot of us, because we were brought up in school on all of these things. All of these nursery rhymes, we were taught how to read, you see, with nursery rhymes. And they have just stayed with us and stuck with us all of these years now, these fables and these incantations about dwarfs and seven-headed monsters and demons and forbidden castles and old wicked witches of the West and all of this type of stuff. We were brought up reading and writing on that. And the Jews, you see, they have a distinctive here in their education. Yes, they did have schools to which the Jews could go, but most of the Jews, unless you were in a privileged family, like we'll see here in a moment, that the man Saul was in, most of the Jews did all of their teaching at home. They didn't have public schools where you had a slave that would take your child there, because what can that person at school teach you that you can't teach your child at home? You see, in the Greek and Roman system, that wouldn't be true. Your teacher there at school might be trained in drama or poetry or the fine arts, something like this, whereas maybe your father is a baker and your mother washes clothes for a living or something. So what can they teach you in that area if that's what you want to learn? The Jews, they didn't want their children. They didn't think it was necessary to learn any of that. They felt it was only necessary to know the law of Moses and know the prophets. And who could teach that better than the mother and the father, who were taught by their mother and father, who were taught by their mother and father, who were taught by their mother and father, who were taught by the prophets and by Moses, and you go all the way back to the very beginning. For instance, in the Old Testament, if you'll turn to the familiar passage of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, the Jews sometimes took this too literally, but they took this literally in that they thought this was their education. And it wasn't public, it was private, it was done in the home. Their textbook was the Old Testament, and they learned how to read out of Genesis and how to write out of Leviticus. And while picking up reading and writing, they got a little theology and a little fear of God in their heart at the same time. Amen. You could probably even get arithmetic out of this, trying to count up the genealogies or something. You could learn to add and subtract and multiply and divide. Try to find out the date of the Exodus or something. You could find out some new dates there. All right, Deuteronomy 6 and 6. These words which I command you this day shall be in thine heart. Thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. And thou shalt, and they took that literally, that they were to talk about the Word, and their children would grow up on terms, for us today like justification and salvation and baptism and Holy Spirit and Pauline epistles. They would grow up on terms like that instead of other types of terms. And for the Old Testament, it would be whatever was appropriate. And probably they took the other verses a little too literally in their ritualism later on. Thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes, and thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house and on thy gates. It's called phylacteries in Matthew 23. Probably he didn't intend for that to be literally done, but spiritually, metaphorically speaking, they should just surround you. They should be on your body and on your home. Wherever your body is or whenever you're in your home, then be talking about the Word, and the children will pick that up. Of course, there are arguments by the school officials today that that's too narrow of an education, and a lot of that, of course, is valid. When you're living in a society like this and you don't even know how to pay your bills because you don't even know anything about electric companies or things like this, I guess you'd be at quite a disadvantage. So I'm not meaning to imply lots of things for us today. Although you can apply certain things for today. I'm meaning to imply things for their day and age. Nothing was necessary for them to know. Why would the Jews have any need of knowing the ancient history of Rome or something? They wouldn't have any need of that. That's not going to help them. They were farmers and fishermen. They needed to know how to farm the land, help their cows give birth whenever they were in labor, know how to fish, know how to plant things and prune things and build things, and they need to know the law of God and the fear of God. And they could get all of that from the instruction of their mother and their father. The mother would teach the young girls, she would even teach the young boys up to a certain age, and then the boys, and we'll give you all of that and the ages and everything later, the boys would be turned over to the father. And today sometimes a little boy stays under mother's wings until he's at least 25. He's still under mother's wings. That's why he comes out with a lisp in his voice all the time, He's been around mother too long. Instead of when he gets 6, throw him out the door and let him haul logs with dad out there. But that mom, her heart goes out, my little boy. 44 pounds is all that he weighs, and daddy's making him lift 2-pound logs out there. I'd rather have him in here with an apron on, cutting cookies out with cookie cutters with little baby Susan in here. Well, that's a perversion, really, of roles right there. To have little Johnny, when he's 10 years old, cutting cookies out with little Susan when Daddy needs some help bush hogging out there, In those days, they did it in the right way. The mother taught the girls, and like I said, the boys up to a certain age. He couldn't be out tromping around with Dad out there at these big cows and oxen out there and get kicked in the stomach and things like this. Keep that boy inside until he gets about 6 years of age. Then he's big enough to bring him on out. I'll teach him how to put a whip on one of these animals out here when he's 6 years old. That animal could squash him, and that whip is 3 times his length or his height. But I'll teach him how to use that out there. So after he reached a certain age, the boys were kicked outside, and they had to go with the father. And if the father was a fisherman, they'd go and just think from the age of 6, learning how to fish. And, you have to go to school now today to learn how to fish. They call it vo-tech, you have to go to school. If you're in vo-tech, that's just a sign of the times. We don't mean that makes you unspiritual. It's just that's what we live in today. Hopefully your children won't have to go to vo-tech and learn how to fish when they're 25. Kick the thing out whenever he's 6 with Dad, and he'll learn. Think if you were 20 and you could say that you had 14 years experience in farming, and you're 20, and you got 14 years experience. Wow. You hear someone when they're 35 saying they've got 14 years experience in something. By the time you're 50, you've got 50 years experience in. Because you've been out there almost from the day you were born learning how to fish. Wow, learning how to fish? There are a lot of intricacies in learning how to fish and what the fish are biting on when the moon was a certain way last night. It takes an old grandpa to really know the secrets about fishing out there. Those guys really know the secrets. It's because they spent years doing that. And all the 20 and 30 years go out there and just throw these big lugger lugs out there and try to whale in a whale or something. And what you need is brought up from the height of a grasshopper on these things, and you begin to learn that. And the girls the same way, but the girls stay inside. They're not outside, all jumping on top of the animals and driving a team of oxen out there when she's 6. She's inside baking bread. Mending her big brother's clothes is what she's doing. Mother will mend dad's and you mend big brother's then. Think if you had been nimble with a thimble since you were 6 years of age. Oh, what a seamstress. You'd just whip through things then. Now you're 20 and you go to college and take home economic classes. And learn how at college, whenever you're 20, how to sew. Well, some of this applies for today, you see. I have some strong Old Testament, Old English values in that area. But then don't go overboard or you'll end up a Mennonite or an Amish if you go too far then. I mean, it can take you so long to darn a sock, you may just want to throw the thing away and go buy another one. Although it wouldn't hurt to know how, though. You may need to know how sometime. I wouldn't know how. Get a fishing needle out or something and start sewing all of this together here. It'd be good to know how to do those things. But, you see, we live in a different society today. You just got to remember that. Where 100 years ago in this country, you would need to know how to do things like that. And all the cooking and the baking and everything like that was helpful today, but it's not as necessary as it was at one time. Because like I said in some recent message, most of the things you have come from the store, even if you bake all the time. Most of what you have, you go pick it up at the store. Nothing wrong with that, just how we live today. And the same is true with the men. You don't know a lot about gardening. You weren't brought up with that. You don't know a lot about animals. You wouldn't know what to do if your horse went into labor, but call a vet. Because that's what you do. Veterinarians are trained in that, so you'd call a vet then. But you know, the old-timers, they know more about that than the vets know. Why? The vets learned in school, and the old-timer learned right there in the straw beside many, many animals, many, many cold nights before, you know. That's where he learned. And so the book tells you, you know, gives you diagrams and everything, but you've got diagrams in your mind. You've seen Grandpa deliver all these little calves over all these years now, and you know a lot about that. Well, see, I wasn't brought up that way. See, I wasn't brought up on a farm. I was brought up in suburbia, USA. And so a whole lot of that just passes over your head that you're not knowledgeable about, not familiar with at all. And like I say, today it's not as necessary to know things like that. You'd be better off knowing computer science almost today than you would be how to deliver a calf. Just tell the calf, let nature take its course. Tell that mother, just let nature take its course. Well, sometimes they need a little help. Well, how do we get way off on that? Calves and sewage disposal systems. What an interesting evening. Deuteronomy 6. Moses would be ashamed of us. No, we're talking about the old ways, the old values there. I don't know if you read that recent article in the paper. I think it was in the paper about the Amish people down in Lancaster County. That's the Amish capital of the world in Pennsylvania. But they don't use all of this modern stuff. And they have much higher yield on their farm than modern farms at a much lower cost. That says something. And it's not just because they work from dawn to dusk, because what farmer doesn't work from dawn to dusk? All the ones around us with all this big equipment, they work from dawn to dusk as well. How is it these people who have horse-drawn and mule-drawn implements, now some of them are gasoline-powered to turn or something, but the horse pulls the thing instead of having to have gasoline to run the whole thing on wheels or something, how is it they have higher productivity, not a lower like you have out there with the big machinery operation, but higher productivity at a lower cost there? They know some things. They've got some ingenuity that's been passed down generation after generation after generation. Right there in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. They know a few secrets about Mother Earth, about the land, about how to till it and how to bring forth. And they know how to skimp and save and work. And after all, an animal, all you can do is just feed him. But a tractor, gasoline, and endless repairs on any type of farm equipment. Endless repairs on those things. And every farmer's a good mechanic. Can you imagine being a farmer, not a mechanic? What a nightmare. Because I know the farmers around us, they're excellent mechanics too. They can work on anything, take anything apart and put it back together. You have to, because it's breaking down all the time. Or that old dependable mule, just feed him in the morning, love him, brush his hair in the evening, give him a bath, soap him down every now and then, or her down, and faithful animal for 15, 20 years pulling. All it takes is food there, no gasoline, and no repair, nothing like that, no heartaches there. Well, I don't know, it speaks to me. These old values have something to say to me. I just say that there's a balance there of going too far. I don't think it hurts you to know as much about that as possible. It puts you more in touch with the older ways of our older days. But you're going to end up sooner or later at a disadvantage in this world if you just stay with the older ways, because they were for older days and not so much for today. Well, you already know that. You got to pay bills today. In those days, you didn't pay bills, really. You just owned the land and lived off your land and fished out of the creek and swam in the brook and things like that. So the Jewish people were different than the others, we're saying. They didn't have 12 grades and then 4 years of college and then 4 years in a graduate program. They just had all their life studying the Old Testament. The children were brought up on it, reading and writing. Now your children may end up in school whenever they're 6, but look at all the training they get from an educational point of view between whenever they're born, in your home anyway, between whenever they're born and whenever they're 6. So familiar with so many concepts and words, even things that they hear right here.
For the continuation of this message, please turn the tape.
So familiar with so many concepts and words, even things that they hear right here. Instead of being brought up on that mind-destroying invention called a television set, where it's just it's got a hypnotic effect on you, where you sit there and listen to Big Goose blabber all the time, saying a lot of nonsense, instead of learning some more important things around the house. It's a form of hypnosis is what it is. The psychologists will say that. Mind-twisting invention is what it is. It just warps your mind, destroys all of your creativity, destroys all of your imagination. Only thing you can think of is what you've seen. You don't have any creativity to you at all because you've never been forced to think. You're just fed from the television set all of these notions. You believe what the television says. The television is the gospel. It's God to most people, especially the little children brought up. When you see these important child-centered figures there, you're brought up with the gospel of television then. And you don't even have the ability to think for yourself. Now, the wealthy families in Israel were more like the wealthy families in other societies. They would send their children off to special places. However, they still differed in the same regard as we've just mentioned, in that what the child went to study was generally connected somehow to religion or to the Bible. For instance, the Apostle Paul, formerly as Saul, had been brought up in rabbinical schools, where he received instruction not only in Old Testament thought, but in the rabbinical interpretation of Old Testament thought, which of course many times warped Moses' teaching as well as the prophets. Paul himself gives us a reference to this in Acts chapter 22 and verse 3. In Acts 22 and verse 3, Paul himself gives us a reference here. We're saying the more wealthy families who had a son that they wished, let's say, to be a scholar, or maybe who himself desired to be a scholar, then they would have to send him away to study. And they would send him away to study under an important rabbi. Now I'm going to use this verse and, well, I'll have to find the other one. Or maybe this is the one I'm looking for. I'll have to read it. Acts 22 and 3. Paul said, who was Saul, Paul said, I'm verily a man, a Jew, born in Tarsus. Now that's up in Asia Minor, a city in Cilicia. Yet brought up in this city. That is the one that I need. Brought up in this city, Now he's speaking in Jerusalem here. Brought up. He said, I was born in Cilicia, Tarsus, the city of Cilicia, which was an important medical and philosophical center of the world. And his parents evidently still lived there in Cilicia. He said, I was born there. He said, but I've been brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel. Now that's the same Gamaliel as Acts chapter 5. And taught, it's a school, taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God as ye all are this day. Now you see, Saul was someone special. He came from an important family. Remember, his family had Roman citizenship. They were probably a socially elite family in Tarsus, as we've already discussed before about Paul and his Roman citizenship. They were probably a socially elite family and therefore probably had money, and therefore could afford to send their little boy Saul, at whatever age, generally around 12 or 13, send their little boy Saul away to the great center of Judaism, capital of Judaism, Jerusalem, and there to have him sit by the feet of the scholar, the important Rabbi Gamaliel, and learn the trade of a rabbi. Now, the trade was very intricate. We'll get into this more when we get further in our studies in the intertestamental period class, when we look at religious backgrounds and the study of the scribes and the rabbis. All of the logic, all of the protocol and formality of rabbinical discussions and disputations. Paul, as Saul, picked all of that up, learned all of that, knew all of that thoroughly. If you look over in the book of Galatians again, in chapter 1, he speaks of this training that he's received. He speaks of the training several times, you see. There it's most specific because he mentions the fact that he was brought up here in this city. Galatians 1:13, for ye have heard of my life in time past in the Jews' religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the assembly of God and wasted it, and profited in the Jews' religion. See, it says twice there, the Jews' religion, the Jews' religion. He doesn't just mean Old Testament teaching, because Old Testament teaching is the same as Paul taught in the New Testament. He means rabbinical teaching. Above many my equals, that is, people the same age as he was, in mine own nation, Palestine, Israel, being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers. The traditions, not just Moses' teaching and that of the prophets, but the traditions. And then another verse in Acts would be Acts 26. Acts 26 and verse 4. This was the one I was thinking of a moment ago. 22:3 teaches that he was brought up at Jerusalem. 26:4 is another reference that teaches that. 26:4, my manner of life from my youth, which was at the first among mine own nation at Jerusalem, know all the Jews. Oh, I know why I was looking for this verse. I knew there was something in my mind. Now it's beginning to click more. It's because we have an interesting translation situation here. And let me just say I'm not going to comment on it dogmatically right now, but let me give you what an alternative is here. We could have the word and between nation and at. That would seem to be more in line with what Paul has just said in chapter 22 and verse 3, because look at how it would read then. Does the NIV have that? It has an and? All right. My manner of life from my youth, which was at the first among mine own nation. Okay, what was his own nation? Cilicia, that's where he was born. At first among my own nation. And then he says, and at Jerusalem. If you don't have and in there, then look what he has, which was at the first among my own nation, Israel, at Jerusalem, know all the Jews. But we know that he wasn't at in his own nation whenever he was a youth, way back in his very early years. He was born, he already told us, he was born in Tarsus of Cilicia. So it's almost like we need a conjunction here to let us know we're talking about two different episodes in his life. One back in his former homeland, which was Cilicia, the Roman province of Cilicia, and the other in Israel. at the capital of Judaism, Jerusalem. So if the NIV gives that, that's what I'm inclined to believe, that we should have a conjunction here. My manner of life from my youth, which was, when you say at the first, then you mean at the first, and then after that you're going to give us a second then, right? Or you'd never say the first. So which was at the first in Cilicia, and he didn't give a second because we can supply that after we got first, and secondly, at Jerusalem. So we have two different things here. Know all the Jews, which knew me from the beginning, if they would testify that after the most straightest sect of our religion, I lived a Pharisee. And now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made of God unto our fathers, and so forth. And something else is clicking in my mind. How can I find it? There's another reference here. I found it. It's in 23. In 23 and verse 6. We'll check and see what the NIV has here, because I know there's another translation problem here. But when Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee. Well, no problem with that. We know Paul's a Pharisee. I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. My father was a Pharisee. Of the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am called in question. Okay, someone give me that after he said, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. What does it have there? Same thing? Well, it could be something different. It could say the son of Pharisees, plural, which would mean not necessarily his father, but past generations, or if it included his father, then his father plus others, such as his father and his grandfather, were then Pharisees. When it just says the son of a Pharisee, that just means one. His father must have been a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Or, of course, we could take son in the Hebrew general sense, just a descendant of one. But I've seen it the other way. I'll have to maybe check that out more if the NIV doesn't follow that. But I've seen it the other way, the son of Pharisees. So anyway, what we're saying is Paul has been brought up this way. Paul had a Saul, who later was Paul, in Acts 13 and verse 13. Paul had a very special form of training, not in a Roman school, not in a Greek school, but he had his training in rabbinical laws. Now it seems, however, that with Paul, first of all, being born in Tarsus, that important philosophical and medical university town in that part of Asia Minor, and B, just growing all the way through the ranks to a very important rabbi himself, that he was able to pick up a lot of extra information about things, because there are some times where it seems as though Paul is either quoting or alluding to certain pagan prophets, certain philosophical teachers of ancient Greece or something. Where did he learn about that? He wouldn't have gotten that just in Old Testament training or something. But since he was brought up in a town, and Tarsus was an important medical and university town there, he may have been able to pick up some things whenever he was young or whenever he was back there for visits. Because, you see, Paul was just into knowledge. You can tell from his writings, Paul was a lover of knowledge. He was a great student in school. He loved to learn things. And evidently he was intelligent enough to pick up not only those religious things that were necessary for his vocation and for his life and upbringing, but the extracurricular things as well, such as maybe studies in philosophy and rhetoric and logic and discussion and disputation and things of that nature. All right, that leaves us with one more thing before we will conclude, and that concerns languages. We've briefed you on this before. We opened the Hebrew studies, biblical Hebrew studies, in acquainting you with the fact that there were basically 4 languages in the Roman Empire. 4 that have anything to do at all with our studies in Palestine. And I'll let you name those 4 since you already know that. What were they? Latin, Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew. Those were the 4 languages, especially as applies to Palestine, which was part of the Roman Empire. Latin, Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew. Okay, in that order, we'll briefly make a comment then. Latin was the legal language. Latin was the legal language, important language of Rome as far as legalities were concerned. Greek was the spoken language. Everybody spoke Greek, even in Rome. Everybody spoke Greek because of Alexander's conquest, the last few decades of the 4th century BC. Aramaic was the common language of the Near East. I bet probably all of you could give me these little statements about each one of these. Aramaic was the common language of the Near East. And Hebrew was the language of theology in Israel. Rabbis spoke and wrote in Hebrew. The manuscripts were in Hebrew. They were copied in Hebrew. Saul obviously was a student of Hebrew. Okay, let's take a few people as an example here. First of all, let's take the Apostle Paul. Did Paul speak Hebrew? Did he speak Aramaic? Did he speak Greek? Did he speak Latin? We don't know. We don't know. He probably did. He probably did. If he didn't speak it fluently, he probably knew enough to get around as far as Latin is concerned. He's just so intelligent, and he had so much to do with Rome, he probably could work his way around in the Latin language. But in Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek, he would have to be fluent, trilingual. He would have to be fluent in all of those. And as you see, almost everyone was bilingual. Everyone in Palestine would be able to speak both Aramaic and Greek. They'd all be bilingual there. If you lived in Rome, you're probably bilingual. You could speak both Greek and Latin. If you lived up in Asia Minor, you're probably bilingual. You could speak Greek and Latin, or maybe Greek and a local dialect of your town or your area or something like that. You could probably hardly find a single person that was restricted in their speaking abilities to one language. And what we have reference to there is United States of America. Most of us here are restricted to one language. Most of the people, let's say in Europe, are not restricted to one language. They can speak several languages. The people in Palestine and Israel today can speak several languages. The people in Mexico can speak several languages. The people in Canada can speak several languages. French and English and Spanish and English and Hebrew and English and German and English and French and German and Russian and Lithuanian. It's remarkable what the rest of the world has. But for we Americans, most of us can only speak one language fluently. Let's take another case study here. What about Jesus? Aramaic? Hebrew? Probably so. Greek? Yes. Latin? Probably not. What about Peter? Aramaic? Greek? Everybody could speak that over there. Latin? Probably not. They probably all knew a few words in Latin, like you know pizza. You know a few words in a foreign language. What'd I leave out? Hebrew? No, not for sure. Seems like he probably could speak Hebrew. Who do you want to deal with? Who would be an interesting one? Some of this we can't answer. I mean, even some of what we're talking about now is just speculation. What about Luke? Let's deal with Luke since he's an interesting case. Greek? Oh, fluent, more fluent than any of the New Testament writers in Greek. Hebrew? Probably not. He probably would have learned it. Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know that we can come to any conclusion on that. You can probably, all of you can see points in favor of both of them. He was around Paul all the time, but Paul's not going to be rattling in Hebrew. He's going to be talking in Greek because he'd be speaking with or in Aramaic. But then Luke's got to write a gospel that's got to be based in line with the Old Testament, though. But the Old Testament existed in Greek then, though, remember. Maybe we could tilt it in the favor of Luke not being able to speak Hebrew. What about Aramaic? You would say so? Aramaic, that's the language of the Middle East now. Where was Luke born? Troas. So we're talking about, that's not definite. I'm just saying, let's assume that he's right there. He certainly was born up somewhere like that, in Asia Minor or Greece somewhere. No Aramaic from that? Oh, I doubt that. I would doubt seriously that he would know Aramaic. Then we say, well, how is he going to converse with everyone back in Palestine? Well, in Greek then. See, Greek was the lingua franca. Everyone spoke in Greek. That's one thing that everyone could speak in then, would be Greek. What I leave out? Latin? Probably. What makes you, what inclines you to probably? Legal. He was an intelligent man. Look at the preface, the first 4 verses. Probably so. Probably so. He probably could speak Latin and Greek. So we're finding some people bilingual, some trilingual, some that can speak 4 languages. No one yet who only can speak 1. Unless that's the raving demoniac over there in Mark 5 who just jabbers in demoniac language or something. No, I'm sure he can speak Aramaic and Greek as well. Maybe not Hebrew, but I'm sure that he can speak Aramaic and Greek. Who else do you want to discuss? Got any other questions on that? I can't necessarily answer them. Nobody can necessarily answer them, but it's an interesting thing to throw around in your mind what languages they could speak. Pilate, Felix. Okay, we're essentially talking about the same type of person there. What could they speak? Latin? Yes. Hebrew? No. Aramaic? Probably not. Greek? All right, bilingual then. Probably Greek and Latin. They'd probably have to be. Everyone spoke Greek, so we can stop saying Greek all the time. Probably they'd have to know Latin though, to be in legal, professional, governmental positions like that. Who else? Joseph and Mary. They spoke Greek, Aramaic, maybe Hebrew. They had to know something about Hebrew. And what about Latin? No, they knew it like they knew Czechoslovakian probably. Hebrew. If they didn't know Hebrew, where did Jesus learn his Hebrew then? Religious schools? Where does it say he went to school? Must have missed that verse. Oh, temple. He was at the temple with some discussions there. And what would the rabbis have been discussing in? What language? In Hebrew then. That means he had to know it before he went there though. Well, where did he get that then? Maybe Mary and Joseph. Surely, you see, Hebrew had passed off the scene as a regular spoken language. But I think we've said in the Hebrew classes, I mean, you've got a German grandmother. She can speak fluent English, and your mother might speak fluent English, and your grandmother speaks fluent German, and your mother's not fluent, but she knows some things about it, and then you know some things about it as you pass down. If you're from that heritage, especially if it's strong, and I don't know if there's anything that has ever been as strong as a Jew. When you are a Jew, you are a Jew. Then you hate to give up that distinctive, and that's the Hebrew language, and just speak in Aramaic. Well, so can some Arab over here speak in Aramaic. Or in Greek, everybody speaks in Greek, so you don't have anything unique then. Wasn't spoken, but they probably knew certain things about the language. And probably Mary and Joseph knew certain things about the language as well. How much? I don't know that I could say. Well, that probably covers most of the interesting people. Now, we're going to say more about that. We're going to do a little more study about some of these languages whenever we get to New Testament introduction, because it'll bring up the question of the original language of the New Testament documents. But practically everyone, as you're seeing, spoke either 2 or 3 languages, and some people 4. Practically everyone spoke 2 or 3 languages. Jesus and his disciples we've already covered.